This is The Law Show on CISL 650. Now back to the show.
Stirling Faux with you. We've got the diner coming up at noon, and we have a couple of lawyers in studio on this episode of The Law Show from the Vancouver firm Maynard Kischer Stojicevic. We're talking immigration law with our immigration and citizenship lawyer guests, Alex Stojicevic and Rudy Kischer. Gentlemen, I wanted to talk a little bit about dual citizenship, as this new Citizenship Act may affect duals, people who are Canadians and citizens of other countries. Alex, what do you know? Again, we don't know it all yet because the government hasn't played out their cards on the table for us all yet. But what do you understand the new Citizenship Act to do with respect to dual citizens?
Well, the type of call that we get in our office quite often, actually, are sometimes people who have heard that there's changes in the Citizenship Act, and they're nervous.
Sure.
You know, I had a fellow call me just last week who has been a Canadian citizen for 15 years, but he's taken a job abroad, a 3-year posting. And he's worried now because of what he's heard, new act, harder to get, easier to lose. Is he going to lose Canadian citizenship by taking his position abroad? Well, for most people, it's not a concern. I mean, for the vast majority of people, being a Canadian citizen, you're a Canadian citizen.
Sure.
But you have to manage if while you're there on your 3-year contract, maybe you're working for an oil company, or maybe you're working for an energy company, or whatever, a multinational.
Right.
You've taken a position for a period of time. If you get married and have a child abroad, you have to be, familiar with the fact that that child is Canadian citizen, but that child's children may not be.
Oh, right.
You need to know that.
Right.
And there are certain activities now that could cause you to lose your citizenship. For example, if you were convicted of a terrorist offense, you can lose Canadian citizenship. Well, that doesn't sound that terrible, and I'm sure most of the people listening are going to say,
not
hey,
going to happen to me.
Not going to happen to me. But let's take an example. I mean, Sterling, I interrupted you.
No. I was just going to say, in some other jurisdictions, the definition of terrorism may not be exactly the same as it is in Canada. Well, that's all I was going to say.
If you take a look at our the Egyptian Canadian Mohammed Fatemi, who is in prison now in Cairo, he went for Al Jazeera to interview people in the Muslim Brotherhood who were, effectively being purged, if you will, by the Egyptian government.
Right.
Now, regardless of what one's thought is on the Muslim Brotherhood, this fellow went there to do a job. He went to interview people.
Right.
He was a journalist, an accredited one, and he was thrown in prison and convicted of terrorist offenses by the Egyptian government.
Because he interviewed some of their political opponents.
So now, we all of a sudden, any Canadian who goes abroad, who's dual, particularly if you're dual, you're now at risk of if a government that decides for whatever reason, is sedition, or how about if you say something against the King of Thailand, like John Oliver did on his show,
right?
Or how about importing
a few months ago?
How about importing goods into Palestine to be used at refugee camps, bringing in food or medicine like that?
All of a sudden,
you're arrested for that.
That's right.
You could lose your citizenship, even though what we understand is terrorism and what the other country that we're talking about is can understand terrorism to be are very different.
And part of that, if I'm not, I have limited understanding, less so than you do, but my understanding so far of this new citizenship law is if you are convicted abroad, you're not going to be allowed back into Canada.
Well, they'll take your citizenship away.
You're stuck wherever you've been convicted, and we cut you loose. See ya, and that's it.
Well, now, the government says they're not going to use the act against people like Fatemi. John Baird actually said as much, as did Chris Alexander. They made public statements that there was not their intention to use it in situations like this. It is more designed for people, I think my colleague would agree with me here, that go volunteer for CISL and fight abroad.
And, exactly.
Well, that's the way we hope the government intends to use it. But I mean, the problem is once you give the government power, you never know how it's going to be used.
20 years from now, when there is no Baird or Alexander in office, is that going to be a defense? Minister Baird said no, we wouldn't use it 20 years ago.
So you're talking about some anxiety already being voiced by clients and people who are calling you randomly with respect to these travel provisions. So as I understand it, if you have Canadian citizenship, if you've become a Canadian citizen from another country, then and you start to travel, you need to maintain a certain profile of residency in Canada in order to retain your citizenship. And if you go and some of these days fall away, Rudy, then and you don't do the math right, you could simply forfeit your citizenship by virtue of absenteeism.
Well, I think there's a risk that under the new provision you have to actually have the intention to remain in Canada. So it's not a fact that you're going to lose your citizenship through absenteeism. It's more an effect that you've left Canada. Did you have that intention to leave Canada when you actually swore your citizenship? So you've got the job offer.
We're the country of convenience in that regard.
You're planning on going back to Hong Kong
Sure.
for a job. You've been in Canada for 6 years. You've been offered this great job. In the meanwhile, your citizenship application sometimes are taking 3 years now. That's not unheard of.
Right.
In the meantime, you get this job. You're like, well, I want to complete my citizenship, and then I'll come. Well, you've got the intention to leave. Is that a misrepresentation? Could they come after you for that? The way the Act is written right now, they could. And I think that's the risk that people have to be, that we're as lawyers a little bit concerned about, because the way the law is written, that's exactly how it could be applied.
And before my mind goes too far wandering on this, I want to ask perhaps a really silly rudimentary question, but if you're a Canadian citizen born and raised in this country and you go away for several years for work or school or just become a citizen of the world, are there ever any risks of your citizenship being forfeited due to, again, absenteeism?
No, there is no risk. But the problem is then, and this
well,
is the point
there are
by some
changes
people.
coming down. We have to ask these questions now.
There are ways, though, that citizens, dual citizens, born in Canada, or people who have a claim on a second citizenship and don't necessarily have it, can now lose citizenship. If you're convicted of treason, of an offense under the National Defense Act, of sedition, of half a dozen offenses in Canada now, and you get a life sentence, you could actually lose your citizenship. I'm born in Canada. I could, because I have a claim on a second citizenship, I'd have to prove, obviously I'd have to be convicted of one of these things and be given a life sentence, but you could now lose citizenship, which is the first time in history we've ever had the possibility that a Canadian could lose citizenship even if they're born here. You cannot be rendered stateless, so it only applies to someone who has a claim on a second citizenship.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But the way the Act is worded, you have to prove you don't actually have that citizenship.
Okay.
To raise that statelessness defense.
So what is the point of having, this punishment of banishment or exile?
Right.
Right? When we already have a criminal code that punishes these people adequately, I would say. Right?
Yeah, and I mean to go with Rudy's point, if you're convicted of treason and got a life sentence, how much would you serve in jail, right, Rudy?
You'd think a life sentence, right?
So what's the point of stripping them of citizenship as well? That seems unnecessarily punitive for, what's the purpose of that provision? And we looked up when the last time somebody got a life sentence for treason. I think it was 1946.
Oh, okay.
So
it seems a bit draconian, doesn't it? Dwayne, hang on for a second, because we need to take a break. But I want to just, in a quick sentence, and if we need to go there, we'll pick it up afterwards. How much does this post 9/11 national security mentality play into these changes in the Citizenship Act, Rudy?
Well, I think there's definitely a siege mentality, right? And with this sort of, this new type of terrorism that we've seen since 9/11, and the stuff that happened on Parliament Hill.
Oh, sure.
Although that was all after the Citizenship Act, it's given the Conservatives fodder to say, we have to do this. We have to sort of differentiate ourselves from these other people that are, doing these horrible acts. And although we're saying they're part of our Canadian family, we give them citizenship, that's not forever anymore. You're no longer, and we want to cut them out. And I think they're using it. I think these cases are so rare that they're going to happen. It seems a lot of legislation for something that is not going to be used very often.
We'll take a quick break and come back with lots more. It's The Law Show on CISL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CISL 650.